The lawyer for former gun squad detective Marcus Taylor tried to pick away at the credibility of Taylor's former police colleagues in the squad who testified against him. Ridiculous, she called a claim of Maurice Ward, who testified he threw away $20,000 taken in a robbery rather than keep it. Each witness, she said, had baggage. Reasonable doubt is all over this case, she said. It walked in the front door of the courthouse, the side door, and the back door. The defense lawyer is Jennifer Wicks. Taylor and Daniel Herschel are charged with robbery, extortion, and overtime fraud. Herschel hopes to convince jurors he committed no more than theft. Taylor's lawyer argued there is little corroboration of the testimony provided by 4 former detectives and current and former drug dealers. The government has gone to the depth of the criminal underworld and authorized them to testify with immunity, Wicks said. It is deplorable and nauseating. Prosecutors underlined the allegations against the 2 former detectives. What is deplorable and nauseating is not that they were exposed, but that they did those things, prosecutor Leo Wise said. The prosecutor criticized defense lawyers grilling witnesses who were drug dealers who testified they'd been robbed. Whether they were selling drugs or Girl Scout cookies, Leo Wise told jurors, it doesn't matter. Jurors will resume on Monday, not tomorrow. Some jurors expressed concern that to meet here tomorrow would be a hardship, as this case has normally met Monday through Thursday. Thus, back here first thing Monday morning. Reporting live from the federal courthouse, I'm Jane Miller, WBAL TV 11 News.